Good morning. The paper we're presenting today investigates the dimensions of diversity and inclusion in the setting of scientific academies, and in particular in the field of management. It is part of a wider conversation that CIMA has begun with other international academies, beginning from a PDW that CIMA organized at the Academy of Management in Boston last summer. The idea is to look at and work together to find the potential benefits, the major challenges, best practices, new actions to take, and to diffuse these internationally within academies. Surprisingly, the state of the art of where scientific academies are today relative to the issues of diversity and inclusion is still a question to be resolved. This paper tries to fill that gap. In particular, if you consider research in the field of D&I, it is now widely accepted that adopting an inclusionary approach to the various heterogeneous dimensions within an organization can bring with it huge potential benefits. Many of the aspects underscored include greater creativity, flexible problem solving, originality, participation, talent promotion, and just more in general, ethics and humanity. If we look at the research conducted on D&I in the field of academia, we'll find quite a rich selection of studies that are applied to higher education institutions and universities in particular. This literature can be divided into different groups according to the kind of aspect in D&I that gets underscored in the different studies. In fact, if we look at the studies conducted in the United States, D&I is mostly referred to racial and ethnic diversity within organizations. Instead, if you consider Europe and studies conducted in this context, D&I is mostly concerned with aspects regarding gender and the notion of glass ceiling. Here we find nations that are labeled as male-dominated, like the Irish one, or nations in which it is highly demonstrated that the shift towards inclusion of different gender in higher education is moving from a de jure to a de facto quite rapidly, as in the Lithuanian case. If we consider Italy's data, gender certainly is still a problem in these kinds of institutions. Only 38.2% of faculty inside universities are represented by females. Only 24.9% of total full professors in Italy are females. Actually, if you look at the data between the total number of faculty who are females and what percentage of that faculty actually reaches full professorship, that percentage is 16%. If you shift that to the male community, the percentage rises to 30%. Which in actual fact means that men have double the possibility of becoming full professors than women. This is not just a question of individual careers and aspirations. It actually has a very strong influence on who governs these institutions and the decisions taken by them. Governance levels within academia and academic institutions usually are accessible only to who is already a full professor. Therefore, it's not surprising to find that in a nation like Italy, only 6 out of 81 rectors are female. If this is the situation relative to universities, what can the role of academies be? Studies conducted on academias and scientific societies underscore the relevance of these bodies in bringing ahead values and standards in the field of research, in the field of teaching, skill formation, and legitimacy within a wider society. There's no reason, therefore, to imagine that academies and societies should not play a very important and relevant role in bringing ahead and legitimizing and diffusing the values of D&I in a wider society. So the objective of this study is exactly to try and photograph the state of the art and how much academies today are, in the field of management, are actually moving towards diffusing the values of D&I. In conducting this study, we adopt the lens of institutional theory, according to which the goals of professional bodies may be achieved by both, on the one hand, formal structures that help to gain symbolic positioning, and on the other hand, actual proactive actions on behalf of academies. With this in mind, we focus on academies that are affiliated or associated to the Academy of Management, and therefore highly reputed academies in the international field. And our research investigates, therefore, the formal and the substantial expressions of how these academies are actually posed towards D&I. We do that by looking, on the one hand, on the formal issue of their mission statements, and on the other hand, by looking at their practical stances of policies and practices. In particular, our research questions are: do Academy mission statements mention the values of D&I, and what do Academy mission statements actually say about their level of commitment to D&I, and in which dimension? The second research question is concerning D&I topics. Is there a coherence between mission statements and policies in academies? And how do academies actually implement practices in D&I? And can we consider an academy D&I oriented even if it is not actually mentioned in their mission? The sample of academies we considered were CIMA and the Academy of Management, and a number of affiliated and associated societies to the Academy of Management. In total, the academies we looked at were 20. To answer research question 1, we used consolidated objective and subjective content analysis methodology that has been applied generally to mission statements. To answer research question 2, we analyzed the disclosed policies and practices that are promoted by the academies we studied in their D&I commitment. To answer the first question and the objective analysis of mission statements, we looked at if and how many times words such as diversity, inclusion, or similar words such as inclusiveness were actually explicitly mentioned in the mission statements of the academies under analysis. Out of 20 academies analyzed, only 5 included a specific reference to words such as diversity and inclusion. It's worth mentioning exactly which academies these are. It's the British Academy of Management, the European Academy of Management, the European Group for Organisation Studies, Australian and New Zealand Academy of Management, and the Brazilian AMPTA. Funnily enough, when CIMA organized the PDW at the Academy of Management last year, it was precisely these 5 academies that answered our invitation, along with the Academy of Management itself and CIMA. Therefore, what we can first say is that an actual explicit commitment to these values is pretty low in the academies we were considering. We then proceeded to a subjective content analysis in order to try and find exactly to what communities these academies refer to, move towards integrating, diffusing values, setting standards. Where is it that they want to position themselves? Amongst the different type of criteria that the literature proposes, stakeholder, orientation, and component perspective, this study will focus on stakeholder perspective. In analyzing the mission statements under the mission statements of the academies we've chosen, 7 stakeholders emerged, in particular scholars, teachers and educators, young researchers, industry and business, practitioners, national culture and country, public policies and politics. By analyzing the stakeholders mentioned in the mission statements and the extent to which they were mentioned, it is possible to pull out 4 clusters amongst the academies analyzed. In particular, if we see and analyze the similarity index and a heat map that indicates how much there is an overlap between mission statements relative to the different stakeholders that can be mentioned, that were mentioned, we find that the clusters are 4. The first is academies that actually are strongly national, country or culture oriented. These academies tend to be regional academies, such as African, Asian, Ibero Academies of Management, but also Brazil and la Academia de Ciencias Administrativas. In this case, the academies draw attention to culture, ethnicity, and how they are distinguished from other international academies. In the second cluster, the concept of scholars, teachers, educators is the strongest in their mission statements. For example, Academy, whose positioning relative to this dimension is extremely strong, is they say we inspire and enable a better world through our scholarship and teaching about management and organization. The third cluster has a much wider equilibrium between all the stakeholders mentioned before. In this cluster we find academies such as the fourth cluster is a much smaller cluster in which we find URAM and CIMA, as well as the Western Academy of Management. And these are mission statements that are very strongly oriented towards public bodies and policy making. So they try to set the standard and legitimacy of management research through dialoguing with public bodies. This analysis was further brought ahead through a correspondence analysis, a statistic method that is aimed to render explicit the overlap between tables that include many variables on a bidimensional or low-dimensional Euclidean space. As this diagram shows, the center of the diagram is actually populated by those academies that are more equilibrated in mentioning all the stakeholders that have been mentioned overall. In fact, at the center of the diagram, we find academies in cluster 3. Instead, the clusters that are more starkly positioned relative to specific stakeholders are more attracted to the sides of the diagram. Those academies that are more similar to each other will be positioned close to each other, and that's how we bring out the clusters in this very clear way. The other last element to show is also that the way the academies are positioned, whether in an acute angle or an obtuse angle, relative to specific dimensions or stakeholders in this specific analysis, depends on whether the stakeholder was mentioned or not. In this way, correspondence analysis is a neat way to give an image of a very strong groups that have formed relative to the communities to which academies are actually speaking and supporting in their symbolic positioning relative to specific groups of academics. To answer research question 2, and therefore to see whether there is coherence between mission statements and practices, and to see what the policies and practices of academies are, the first thing we did was look at their policies, and therefore look at ethical codes, strategic plans, D&I-specific policies. And here we found, first of all, a very high coherence. And the 5 academies that had explicitly mentioned D&I in their mission statements equally bring ahead the same values in their ethic codes or other policies that they bring ahead. But we also find D&I in the ethical codes of CIMA and in those of academies. So the number of academies at this point actually grows a little bit. When we look at the other dimension as practices, we try to see which divisions and special interest groups characterize or brought ahead in the actual activities of the academies considered. Here too, the academies that had mentioned D&I in their mission statements are coherent in the divisions and special interest groups that are dedicated to dimensions of D&I. But we find it also very present in the Academy of Management overall. So it is a little wider than those 5 that we found initially. Also, what we looked at is if that you consider the activities actually brought ahead within the strategic interest groups or divisions, therefore the papers presented, the conferences, the special issues that are actually brought ahead in the conferences of these academias, we find a very growing attention towards issues of D&I. And therefore we can see that from bottom up, within the special interest groups, within the divisions, issues of D&I are becoming more and more consciously centered in these academias. The third aspect we looked at in their practices was the board of directors, and trying to see how much boards were balanced in terms of gender, national affiliation, academic position, country of origin. And in this sense, the academias were very much more balanced than others. Therefore, what we could say is that the ones that brought ahead D&I explicitly in their mission statements were coherent, but that the group of academies that actually bring ahead D&I policies and practices in their in action are more than the ones that actually took it in consideration in mission statements. So what we can say in conclusion is that mission statements do help to communicate institutional roles and positioning of academias, and that it's possible to look at and find several distinct clusters of scientific academies in the field of management, which look at different types of orientations and integrations of the academy towards specific communities. However, implicit adoption of different forms of D&I in policies and practices are wider than those that are actually explicitly adopting these values in their mission statements. So, we can see that many academies are beginning to move their first steps in implementing social policies and practices, especially towards the dimensions of board composition and themes treated in practice in D&I, in divisions and special interest groups, whereas these themes are trickling into the conversation. Thank you.